Okay, if people would take their seats. So, welcome to the second John Sinclair Memorial Lecture. Galan Jali, the greeting phrase for the Bachelor people, the original inhabitants and custodians of Gari. I'm Peter Shooter, the past president of the Gari Fraser Island Defenders Organisation, best known for our acronym FIDO, and our symbol, the bulldog, protecting the natural assets of Gari. I have great pleasure in introducing Les Meltzer. Les is a senior bachelor Gubbi Gubbi man. He's a former head of the Queensland Department of Aboriginal Affairs, former chairman of FARA, the Foundation for Aboriginal and Islander Research Action, a role in which he was a delegate to United Nations Forums on Indigenous Affairs. Les will welcome us and pay respect to the Bachelor and Gubbi Gubbi people. Thank you, Les.
Thanks very much, Peter, and I'm very, very pleased to have this opportunity to do this welcome and acknowledgement of country. I have to admit, though, it took me 25 minutes driving around the university here to find my way, so in terms of being on country, I still haven't got it all together. But I'll tell you that I'm loath to do welcome to country at any time because I'm a land rights activist, and I'm not happy about the fact that we are still not holders of our land and territories and so on, and I don't understand why we would go and welcome people to it and they got it for nothing and we got pushed away. But I'm quite happy to do acknowledgement of country, and certainly in this instance I'd like to acknowledge this is the territories of the Gubbi Gubbi peoples and the Bachelor, and you probably are well aware, all of you, that Bachelor is actually a subset of Gubbi Gubbi. It's a dialect language difference, but in fact everything between Gubbi and Bachelor is interchangeable in that sense. I don't necessarily get that agreement coming from my colleagues who are Gubbi Gubbi or Bachelor, but that's certainly the way we were brought up. My grandmother was born at Maiva. I don't know if you know where Maiva is, but it's an old Aboriginal campgrounds which exists right in the cusp between Bachelor and Gubbi Gubbi country, and we were always brought up to see no distinction between the groups. I have long known about FIDO. As was mentioned, I worked in the Queensland government under the Goss government in 1994, which is when some very good things happened, particularly in the Great Sandy region and in relation to Fraser Island. A little bit disappointed from my point of view that the recommendation that 200,000 hectares of Fraser Island should be given to Aboriginal control ended up being, I think, about 10 acres, a 30-year lease. But that battle's still going on and so on. And of course, native title, you're probably aware, invokes no property rights whatsoever. We're allowed to temporarily live on Fraser Island. We can hunt, fish and gather, but we've always been able to do that, and we've always done that. And for the most part, the things that we have under the native title agreement at the moment is the same thing that any tourist coming up from Sunshine Beach, Rainbow Beach, coming onto the island for the day and so on. The only thing we have that's unique is the fact that we can be buried on Fraser Island. So that's something I have to look forward to. So anyway, in knowing, I followed very much the work that was being done, particularly by John Sinclair and the group and the activism that was there to protect Kagari, and that while I didn't, this is I think the first time I've come together to a group that might be identifying as FIDO, but I would have met many of you in different circumstances around the whole thing. So when I heard about the memorial lecture, I was very pleased to be able to come along, and then of course very happy to do an acknowledgement welcome you to do what you have been doing, and that is support the conservation and the protection of the territories, ensure that the environment is not being destroyed, and to do what is necessary at the campaigning level, at the political level, to fulfil those obligations. So a lot has been achieved, but of course, I think we all know that the risks are still there. We had the big fires recently, of course, but the amount of four-wheel drives going up and down the beach, that's not so much of a problem, but certainly going across the island on what had been existing roads, but they're becoming very much worn out now. And I think one of John Sinclair's latest statements that I picked up was about there needs to be some sort of transport like light rail or something on Fraser, and I agree 100% that there's a lot of damage that can happen from the way in which it gets marketed to the day tourists and to the casual tourists, because we all know, and I'm sure we'll hear today about the unique qualities that K'gari has, and many different arguments as to why it needs to be protected and will need to be protected in the future. So very much on behalf of Gubbi Gubbi and Bachelor, I'd like to say welcome to this meeting and to Meeting on Country to talk about the things that we all share in common, and I hope look forward to the fact that we can continue to do this into the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Les. Now, before I introduce Ian, there is some housekeeping. The muster point, if you go out the entrance that we all came in and turn left up towards the far end of this building, that's the muster point. Toilets, if you go out again where we came in, but inside the building, if you turn either right or left, there are toilets. There are toilets either way. So John Sinclair was a remarkable environmental campaigner and a wonderful human being. He spent much of his life with Bachelor people, for whom he had great respect. In his latter days, John told me that much of the development of his character was influenced by two things: the Masonic Lodge and the Bachelor culture. It's a curious combination, but it ended up producing a remarkable personality and character. Sadly, John died at age 79 in February 2019. FIDO established the John Sinclair Memorial Lecture to honour the contribution John made not only to the protection of K'gari, but to universal environmental advocacy and campaigning. The inaugural John Sinclair Memorial Lecture was delivered by Dr. Isla Keto, renowned environmentalist and activist, and President of the Australian Rainforest Conservation Society. Today I have the pleasure of introducing our second lecturer, Professor Ian Lowe. Ian was formerly educated as a physicist. For over 40 years he worked on aspects of energy supply and use, especially environmental consequences such as climate change, as well as broader aspects of sustainable futures. Both Isla and Ian Lowe were contemporaries and friends of John Sinclair. They worked beside John as environmental educators, campaigners and advocates. They did this in challenging times when the political landscape in Queensland was not always positive. We on the Sunshine Coast proudly claim Ian as one of us. He lives here. He's an adjunct professor at this university, the University of the Sunshine Coast, patron of the Sunshine Coast Environment Council, and regular presenter at the Woodford Folk Festival. As well, Ian proudly wears the baggy green as a member of the Australian over-70s cricket team. I'm very pleased to introduce the second John Sinclair Memorial Lecturer, Professor Ian Lowe. The topic of Ian's lecture, honouring John Sinclair's legacy, protecting our unique biodiversity. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Peter. I prefer not to use the microphone, but if I become inaudible, wave and I will resort to technology. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the Gubbi Gubbi people as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. I've said to a few of you that paying respect to elders hasn't been a part of our whitefella tradition, but I have to say the idea appeals to me as I totter unsteadily into that category myself. It's become almost a tradition to acknowledge the owners, and even politicians usually remember to do it, but it should be much more than a tradition. This is what Alan Moyer thought about the situation of the first Australians. The first Australians worked out over tens of thousands of years how to live within the limits of the natural systems of this harsh and unforgiving continent. And they embodied those knowings not just in custom and practice, not just in song and dance and ceremony, but in their system of laws. And that legal framework allowed them to live sustainably for tens of thousands of years until a few waves of illegals who thought they knew better disrupted those practices. But we really should be learning from the traditional owners who have a wealth of knowledge about the natural systems. And one of the points I'm going to make is that we are still alarmingly ignorant about some aspects of our biodiversity, which makes the task of conserving it especially difficult. I want to acknowledge the members of the Sinclair family who are here, and I'm not going to spend much time talking about John's legacy because you're all familiar with the wonderful work that he did, first to protect the island from sand mining, then to end logging, the World Heritage listing, the recognition of the Great Sandy region. I had a few years with John on the Council of the Australian Conservation Foundation, and his legacy is not just the protection of the island and the Great Sandy region, but the extent to which conservation has become part of the general political dialogue in Australia. The fundamental point I'm going to make is that the future is not somewhere we're going, it's something we're creating. Experts are paid large amounts of money to tell you what the future will be, and most of the time they are wrong. One wit observed that it's difficult to make forecasts, especially about the future. And the reason it's difficult to tell us what the future will be is that there are many possible futures, and which one occurs will be the product of our decisions and actions as individuals, members of households, members of groups, members of communities, members of organisations. The Australia in which we live today has been shaped by the decisions and actions of our forebears, and we can identify, particularly here on the Sunshine Coast. Elaine has devoted years to chronicling the atrocities which were proposed by the White Shoe Brigade at different times and were stopped by the concerted action of local people. Just as the Sunshine Coast we live in today has been created by the decisions and actions of previous generations, we are shaping the Sunshine Coast of the future. And I think it's axiomatic that from the wide range of possible futures, we should be trying to shape one that is at least in principle sustainable, able to be sustained, if not forever, at least for the foreseeable future. Because behaving in a way that is not sustainable is essentially funding our lifestyle at the expense of future generations, our own children, our own grandchildren, and that's clearly not morally appropriate. Now, it shouldn't be contentious to say that we're committed to a sustainable future, because 30 years ago, COAG, meeting in simulated majesty in Canberra, adopted the National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development, signed up to by the Commonwealth and all state and territory governments. So in principle, our state government, our national government, whether Labor or coalition, whether there are Teal independents or not, is committed to, and I quote, a path of economic progress that does not impair the welfare of future generations, to striving for equity within and between generations, recognising the global dimension of what we're doing, protecting our biological diversity, maintaining the integrity of our natural ecological systems and processes. It might have escaped your attention that this is the fundamental principle to which all our governments adhere and within which they make all of their day-to-day decisions. Well, I think it would take a very generous assessor to detect any sign that any recent governments, state or Commonwealth, Labor or coalition, even know there is a national strategy for ecologically sustainable development, let alone seeing that as the guardrails within which they should be working. Sorry, that didn't work. Sorry, I decided to. Sorry about that. 25 years ago, a group that I chaired produced our first national report on the state of the environment. And it said we have a beautiful and unique environment. Much of it is in good condition by international standards, but we have some serious environmental problems that we said 25 years ago needed to be dealt with immediately to achieve our stated goal of living sustainably. And we said the problems weren't simple, they were the cumulative consequences of the growth and distribution of our population, our lifestyle choices, the technologies we use, and the demands they make on natural resources. The 5 big problems, and the top of the list, loss of our unique biodiversity. The other serious problems, pressures on the coastal zone, the state of our inland rivers, degradation of rural land, greenhouse gas emissions. The 5 big problems identified 25 years ago. There have been a succession of reports since then, and basically they have all identified the same 5 problems. We also said in that first report that a fundamental problem of protecting our biodiversity is our limited knowledge. More than 1 million species are thought to live in Australia. Less than 15% had been formally described 25 years ago. And given the pathetic underfunding of taxonomy, we're probably still well below 20%. So it's really almost indefensible hubris to talk about managing the environment. It'd be like saying that the coach of one of the teams who were rolling around in the mud in Melbourne this afternoon had only met 3 of the players, but he knew them quite well and he hoped that the other 15 would fit in somewhere around them. You couldn't possibly aspire to manage a football team if you'd only met 15 or 20% of the players. And the lack of knowledge about our diversity is the most significant impediment to its conservation. We just don't know what we're losing. What we do know is that extinction has effects up and down the food chain. If a species disappears, that has implications for the other species for which it was a food source. It also has implications for the species on which it predates. So the loss of any species has implications up and down the food chain. And at the moment we're basically pulling random bricks out of the complex wall of life in complete ignorance of when whole sections are likely to collapse. The latest State of the Environment report, delivered to the Morrison government last year but suppressed by them and recently released by Tanya Plibersek, said overall the state and trend of the environment in Australia is poor and deteriorating. Increasing pressures from climate change, habitat loss, invasive species, pollution and resource extraction. And it made the point that protecting the environment isn't a luxury. It's not just for aesthetic reasons. They said in that State of the Environment report, our health, our living standards, our cultural and spiritual fulfilment and our connection to country are all interconnected and are all negatively impacted by our deteriorating environment. We are all suffering from the loss of our biodiversity. The key findings in the chapter on biodiversity: biodiversity is essential to human survival, well-being and economic prosperity. It's not a luxury, it's the foundation of the system on which we depend. Our biodiversity is declining, the number of threatened species is increasing, climate change, habitat loss and degradation, invasive species are the key threats. We have some protected areas, some recovery efforts and better management, but they're really, at the moment, sending a water pistol to put out a bushfire. They are pathetically inadequate compared with the scale of the problem. In the subsection on declining biodiversity, they made the point that we have been very poor at monitoring the state of our biodiversity, that we just don't know what's out there, so we can't assess the state and trend of most species with any confidence. But most indicators that exist show the trend of both plants and animals is declining, the number of threatened species is increasing, and we can expect further extinctions over the next 2 decades. And we need also to recognise that the number of threatened ecological communities is also increasing. So what are the key threats? Well, the pressures are still increasing because historically the main causes of the loss of species have been habitat loss, invasive species and chemical pollution. And none of those forces is diminishing, and they're now being accelerated by and compounded by climate change. And the report said many ecosystems are now experiencing cumulative and compounding pressures leading to ecosystem collapse. And all of the existing pressures are now being reinforced by accelerating climate change, which was being studiously ignored by our governments until very recently and is still not being dealt with adequately. In terms of recovery efforts, we've added a significant number of Indigenous protected areas to the protected area system, and within those areas, Indigenous rights, Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values have been recognised as central features of conservation management. There are some notable successful initiatives creating predator-free areas to increase the population of threatened mammal species, but the report said, and it's hard to deny this, more work is needed to align our policies with the aspirations of the traditional owners, as we were reminded in the introduction. The only Commonwealth legislation that is there to protect biodiversity, the Howard Government's Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, in principle gives the Commonwealth Government the power to intervene and overturn decisions at the state level which are threatening biodiversity. It has been used once since it was promulgated in 1999 by Peter Garrett when he used it to intervene to stop the Traveston Crossing Dam. So you'd say one intervention in 20 years is a pretty underwhelming response in terms of legislation to protect our biodiversity. And the review by Professor Graham Samuel said basically the law is not working, the law is not protecting our environment, not protecting our biodiversity, and if we are serious about protecting it, we need a better legal framework. At the global level, I want to remind you of a couple of reports. There have now been 6 in the series on the Global Environmental Outlook by the UN, and the 5th one said, and I quote, "The current observed changes to Earth systems are unprecedented in human history. Not a bit unfortunate, not a bit of a worry, unprecedented in human history. Several critical global, regional or local thresholds are close or have been exceeded, and the consequence is abrupt and possibly irreversible changes to the life support systems of the planet." Nearly 30 years ago, a group of scientists issued a warning to humanity about the observable fact that our natural ecological systems are being degraded by the pressure of human consumption. And they issued a second notice 25 years later in 2017, when I made this slide, it had been signed by more than 21,000 scientists, of whom I am one. And it said that since 1992, when they put out their first report, with the exception of stabilising the ozone layer, we failed to make progress in solving any of the foreseen environmental challenges. In fact, most of them are getting far worse. The one success story, the depletion of the ozone layer. Those of us who were around at the time remember when Molina and Rowland did the analysis that showed that chlorofluorocarbons would deplete the ozone layer. The establishment resisted it with every tool in the toolbox. They said it's not proven that chlorofluorocarbons will get into the upper atmosphere, not proven that if they did they'd break down and release free chlorine, not proven if that happened the ozone layer would be depleted. And in the book The Ozone Wars, written in 1979, Dotto and Schiff said, the most irresponsible thing to do, of course, would be to keep releasing chlorofluorocarbons until we could measure the depletion of the ozone layer. Well, it would have been the most irresponsible thing, but that, of course, is what the world did. In 1984, a British scientist measured the hole in the ozone layer in Antarctica. He thought there was something wrong with his equipment, so he said nothing, went back to the UK, developed a new measuring tool, road tested it, took it back to Antarctica, and then said the ozone layer is being depleted. And things then happened quite quickly. The Montreal Protocol and its toughening up at the conferences in Stockholm and London. And at the London conference, remarkably, Margaret Thatcher, who was in social and economic terms so far to the soup spoon she was almost off the table, Margaret Thatcher told the conference, we are not owners of the planet, we are tenants with a fully repairing lease. And if you want to be irrationally optimistic that humans can work together and solve a global environmental problem, the Montreal Protocol, the Stockholm and London amendments have resulted in the release of chlorofluorocarbons now being down to about 20% of what it was at the peak, and the ozone layer is not deteriorating any further. But every other problem is getting worse, as this collection of graphs from the World Scientist's Second Warning points out. Freshwater resources per capita down 25% in the last 25 years. The marine catch down by about 20%. The number of ocean dead zones almost doubled. Total forest area, we've lost about 100 million hectares of forest. In the context of other futile activities that people are engaged with today, I remember telling Philip Adams that we were losing forest around the world at the rate of about a football field a minute. He said the obvious solution is to reforest football fields, preferably at the rate of one a minute, which he said would both solve the problem and be a major contributor to world peace. The sixth graph, vertebrate species abundance, this is the percentage of vertebrate species abundance compared with the 1970 baseline. In the 1992 report, it was down to 60% of the 1970 level. It's now down to 40% of the 1970 level. We are losing species at a rate comparable with the 5 great extinction events in the Earth's history, all of which were caused by natural perturbations over which we had no control, but we are the first species ever to create a mass extinction event purely through our own cleverness. You probably don't need reminding that carbon dioxide emissions have almost doubled in the last 25 years. The rate of climate change has accelerated. And the fundamental point is that both the human population is increasing and so is the population of our domesticated animals. So the alarming statistic is today 96% of the mass of mammals on this planet is humans and our domesticated livestock. 4% is the remaining mass of all the mammals on the planet that are not either humans or our domesticated livestock. Especially troubling, the report said, is the current trajectory of potentially catastrophic climate change. That's pretty strong language of scientists, not you ought to be a bit worried, potentially catastrophic, and we've unleashed a mass extinction event. Many current life forms could be annihilated or committed to extinction by the end of this century. I'll just remind you a bit about what climate change has done in Australia. because up till recently, politicians have behaved as if there was nothing to worry about. This is the consequence of the approximately 1 degree increase in average global temperature, and that's primary school geography. Latitude, altitude, nearness to the sea determines climate. Along the seaboard, the increase in temperature is about 1 degree, but if you look, there's whole areas in Central Australia that have increased by about 2.5 degrees in average temperature. And we're now on track for, well, the most ambitious Paris target was 1.5 degrees. I don't know any reputable climate scientist who thinks that's still possible. The Paris conference said it is not dead but on life support. I think the life support system has been disconnected since then because politicians are still supporting new fossil fuel projects. But the critical point is that 2 degrees will not mean 2 degrees increase everywhere. It'll mean 4 or 5 degrees in Central Australia. And there are whole areas that will be almost uninhabitable at 2 degrees. But the current trajectory is more like 3 or 4. I don't want to worry you, but it's not good. This is the changes in rainfall patterns, and what's really interesting about that is that the more intense monsoonal events in northwest Western Australia have caused a tongue of increased rainfall coming all the way across the centre of Australia as they weaken and become rain depressions. So that it's really noticeable in South Australia where there was never summer rain. They are now getting some summer rain to compensate for the reduced winter rainfall. And farmers everywhere know that climate change is affecting their capacity to grow their crops because the rainfall pattern is changing, the temperature is changing, and of course the amount of carbon dioxide in the air is changing. If you think what crops need to grow, it's carbon dioxide, water and warmth, and we're changing all three. This is, I think, the most disturbing graph that I've seen about climate change. It shows the number of days in each year which are in the 1% of hottest ever recorded in Australia. Now 1% of 365 is 3.65, so you would think if there was nothing going on to worry about, in an average year there'd be 3 or 4 days in the top 1% hottest ever recorded. And for most of the 20th century, it's bumping around there. There were a few where it was 10, there were a few it was 0, the average was 3 or 4. Last year, 44. 44 days were in the top 1% ever recorded in Australia in terms of heat. And this is the map showing the change in the number of dangerous fire weather days. And I think if our civilization survives, it will be because we've come to grips with problems like climate change. And when the history is written, I believe the fires of the Black Summer and the floods of this year will be seen as the critical thing that changed the public mood and which led to the political changes that we saw on the 21st of May when some of those who were in denial of climate change had their lease terminated. I don't want to depress you, but these are the predicted further impacts of climate change, and most of these are baked in because the carbon dioxide we put in the air today will still be there at the end of this century. So unless we invest aggressively in reforesting Australia to take carbon dioxide out, the carbon dioxide concentration will keep increasing, so it will get significantly hotter, especially inland. The long-term drying trend will continue with increased risk of drought, but there will also be more severe storm events and flooding, a greater risk of severe heat waves, and a greater risk of catastrophic fire seasons. And that's based on what we know. But what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said is, and this I think is the big worry, that future climate change could involve surprises because we know the climate system has non-linear characteristics, and that means that at some point, if it's pushed beyond a critical tipping point, it will change rapidly to a radically different system. And our science isn't good enough to predict when that is, but it's good enough to say you should be very worried. And the adage when we were first talking about climate change in the 1980s, that we should manage what we can't avoid, but we should try to avoid what we can't manage. And we are now already pushing our food production system, our biodiversity, into areas that it's difficult to manage. So we really should be going to great lengths to avoid pushing things further. So, as I've suggested, these are the obvious biological effects of climate change. It affects plant growth. It also, because different species respond in different ways to increased carbon dioxide, to changes in temperature regime, changes in rainfall systems, it changes the competition between different plant species, between food crops and weeds. We call anything a weed if it's a plant that we don't approve of. But in natural systems like forests, we are changing the competition between different plant species and changing the regime of disease vectors. So we are changing the diet for herbivores, which changes what's around for carnivores. We are basically interfering with the whole balance of nature by losing habitat, by allowing invasive species in, by chemical pollution, and now by climate change. The Threatened Species Recovery Hub published a paper 4 years ago documenting the fact that since 1788, I can't remember what happened then, you might be able to remind me, Les, did anything significant happen in 1788? Since then we've lost 30 mammal species and 29 bird species. We are in gold medal position with the highest mammal extinction rate of any country in the world. 17 unique Australian birds and mammals are likely to disappear in the next 20 years. And one reason to worry about losing our biodiversity is that an unusually high percentage of the species, plants and animals in Australia are not found anywhere else in the world. So if they're lost in Australia, they're lost to the world. Birds are most at risk in southeastern Australia, and mammals in regions of more recent development like the top end. So this was their list. This is a list of bird species with the probability that they'll be extinct within 20 years. Orange-billed parrot, 87%, regent honeyeater, 57%, and so on. That's just there to remind you that we know of a significant number of endemic Australian bird species that are more than a 50-50 chance of disappearing within the next 20 years. And there's a similar list of mammal species, not quite as alarming. In most cases there's only a 30% chance they'll be lost in the next 20 years, but it's there to remind us that even where we have good information, we know there are species at risk, and we still haven't got anywhere near documenting all of the species that we share this land with. So the overall message of that first State of the Environment report is we have a responsibility to protect our rich biological diversity and our outstanding natural environment. We acquired it by means that could only be described as robbery with violence from the traditional owners, but having acquired it, we are now responsible. We are custodians of it. And as that report said, having a sustainable future, protecting our biodiversity, requires integration of ecological thinking into all social and economic planning. And that's the fundamental problem, because most decision makers behave as if the economy is the be-all and end-all. If only the gross domestic product can be made sufficiently gross, we will have enough money to solve all of our problems, that the environment is an optional extra if there's time and resources and energy left over after the key task of managing the economy. We also need to recognise that we now face global problems, and that is a real challenge to our systems of governance. I wrote recently, I'm quoting from myself because I couldn't find a better source for this, our predominantly national forms of governance cannot cope with the problems we now face. And climate change is the most obvious example. That in all of the conferences from Kyoto on, each country has been there trying to get its share of the carbon budget, or a bit more. And the global systems such as the United Nations have proved almost totally incapable even of their fundamental task of preventing wars, and certainly totally incapable of dealing with the global environmental problems we face. Global problems require global solutions, and fundamentally, if we are going to live within the limits of natural systems and conserve what remains of our biodiversity, we have to eliminate wasteful consumption in parts of the world like ours, and we also need to do something about the obscene levels of military spending. There was a study done by the UN Development Programme 20 years ago, after the Millennium Development Goals were announced by the UN. And the UN Development Programme did a calculation, what would it take to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, or their later reification as the Sustainable Development Goals? What would we need to do? What resources would be needed to ensure that every human on Earth, however carelessly they chose their parents, has clean drinking water, adequate nutrition, reasonable shelter, basic health care, education? Massive task, because at the moment hundreds of millions of people don't have clean drinking water, hundreds of millions go hungry each night, more than 1 billion don't get proper education, and so on. And they realistically calculated that a program to do that in 10 years would cost many trillions of dollars. They then observed that the figure was about 10% of the global military budget. In other words, we wouldn't need anything as utopian as peace breaking out universally. We would only need to shave 10% off the obscene amount that we spend preparing to wipe each other out, to bring about a position where we didn't need to fight for resources, because everyone would have what was needed for a civilized life: clean drinking water, reasonable shelter, adequate nutrition, basic health care, education. The fundamental point, I think, is that we haven't really got to grips with how big a change is needed to achieve a sustainable future. Most decision makers still behave as if a few solar panels, maybe electric cars, maybe a better bus network, and we'll be there. They underestimate the scale of change that will be needed, because at the moment, as humans, we are consuming about 1.5 times what the Earth can sustainably produce each year, and there are still hundreds of millions who don't have the basics of a decent lifestyle. So if the circle is going to be squared, if we're going to stop losing our biodiversity, we have to scale back our consumption. That doesn't mean we need to turn off the lights and shiver in the dark. There was a report given to the Howard government in 2003, the National Energy Efficiency Framework, that pointed out that we could reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by 30% using cost-effective existing technology with a payback time of less than 4 years. And that was on the technology that existed 20 years ago, and there have been significant improvements since then. I think it is quite reasonable to say that we could live at the same level as material comfort as we do today, using 25% of the resources we now do. And the report done by the UN on resource efficiency and economic outlook for the Asia-Pacific region said if the legitimate material expectations of all of the people who live in the Asia-Pacific region, all those in China, in India, in Southeast Asia, are to be met within the limits of natural systems, we need a new industrial revolution in which we meet our needs using 20 to 25% of the resources per person we now do. And that it's a stretch target, but it's not an outlandish one. But fundamentally, it requires a change in the way we think about the world, a change in our values. Paul Raskin, who heads the Telus Institute in Boston, argues that the values that have dominated civilization for the last century are individualism, consumption, and domination of nature. And he said they are now fundamental obstacles to the chance of having a sustainable future. And he argued that we need a new and rather holier trinity from those. He said domination of nature, the idea that natural systems are there at our disposal, we have dominion over them, they're just only of value if we can use them for economic good, needs to be replaced by what he called ecological sensitivity, an awareness that natural systems have limits, and an awareness that we push natural systems beyond those limits at our peril. We really risk our survival if we perturb too seriously the natural systems of the planet. Consumerism, the idea that you're more fulfilled if you have more stuff that you never use, which is reflected in the fact that a large growth area of the economy now is storage. Even though we have the largest new houses of any country in the world, still an increasing number of people have so much stuff they can't keep it in their house, so they have to rent storage where their children will go and put it in a skip when they're no longer using it. That notion, Ruskin argued, needs to be replaced by an emphasis on the quality of life, the quality of the human experience, rather than how much stuff we can accumulate. And finally, individualism really is out the window because the environmental problems we face are global problems. How we farm in Australia affects the weather in China, and how they farm in China affects the weather in Australia. So we really need to move beyond the insularity of our town or our state or our country to what Ruskin called human solidarity, an identification with the whole human family, because we are all in this together. About 30 years ago, I was at a conference in Sydney, and the then Premier of New South Wales, trying to show that he wasn't just a pragmatic fixer, but a person who thought about the big picture, put up this Venn diagram. And it says, sustainability is about living within our means, managing our consumption of resources, balancing environmental, economic and social outcomes. And the Venn diagram he put up has the economic, the social and the environmental as three domains of equal size and importance. I was on the panel as the token ratbag, and I said that I thought the fundamental problem is that the Venn diagram most decision makers have is what I've called the pig-headed model, in which the economy is the main game, like the face of a pig, and society and environment are minor protuberances, less important domains. And as an illustration of that, if you tell a politician that the Great Barrier Reef is endangered in its unique ecological system, you can see their eyes glaze over. But when you point out that the tourist industry associated with the Great Barrier Reef employs 60,000 people, oh, that's a serious problem, we've got to do something, or at least we have to look as though we're doing something about it. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding based on the delusion that as long as the economy is going gangbusters, we can deal with the minor social and environmental problems. Markets give us things that we want, but increasingly they give us things that we don't really want but have to be persuaded to want. Clive Hamilton said the purpose of the advertising industry is to persuade us to use money we don't have, to buy things we don't want, to impress people we don't like. And Richard Eckersley rather neatly said, if you analyse advertising, what it has done is transformed the 7 deadly sins, pride, lust, greed, sloth, envy, into the marketing imperatives of the modern world. Because very little advertising actually gives you any factual information about the product, but it appeals to your pride or your greed or your envy or your laziness or your lust to try and persuade you to buy something you don't really need. On the other hand, natural systems give us the things that we absolutely need: breathable air, drinkable water, the capacity to produce our food, and things that are very important like our sense of place, our sense of identity that we get from the natural systems. You look out the window and you know that you're on the Sunshine Coast. You're not in Melbourne, you're not in Bratislava. That's your sense of place, your sense of identity. I tell people if you look at the Earth from space, you can't actually see the economy. What you can see is some of the natural features that we use as boundaries between polities, like oceans and mountain ranges. And if you start with the view from space, you come up with what I think is a much more rational Venn diagram, one that recognises that human society is enclosed within and totally dependent on the natural ecological systems of this planet. And the economy is just a subset of our society, a quite important subset to be sure, But there are things we expect from society, like our sense of identity, our culture, security, companionship and love, that are not even in principle part of the economy. And we really need to get used to thinking of the big picture, thinking of how the economy fits within society, how our society fits within the natural systems of this planet. So the criteria, quick shopping list, what we need to do by next Tuesday. Stabilise population, stabilise per capita consumption, a circular economy so that resources don't make a one-way trip from the mine to the product to the rubbish bin, but the waste from one product becomes the resources for another. And there are significant car companies who now say their aim in design is at the end of the life of the vehicle, nothing goes to landfill. Everything is either recycled or repurposed and reused. We need to stabilise the global climate, halt biodiversity loss, produce a more equitable society, and that of course needs a new ethical basis, a new set of values. Now I can see even in a friendly audience like this, a few people thinking that's a bit naive, a bit utopian. At one level it is. But I want to remind you that all of the significant advances throughout human history have been decried as utopian when they were first proposed. 200 years ago, it was utopian to be arguing for the end of slavery. And the abolitionists were told they were economically naive because no society could function without slave labour. 100 years ago, in most parts of the world, except civilised ones like Australia and New Zealand, people were still fighting for women to have the vote. And you can still read the speeches from the bewhiskered patriarchs in our state parliament saying society would crumble if unreliable people like women were allowed the vote. Now, of course, looking back, it seems ridiculous that for so long people put up with slavery or women not having the vote, because once things changed, it changed irreversibly to a new way of seeing the world, and the old way was no longer tenable, no longer defensible. That's ancient history, and it is. But I remind people that only 25 years ago, it was still utopian to be dreaming of Berlin without the wall, or South Africa without apartheid, or an apology to stolen generations, or an African American being elected as US president, or female political leaders in Australia, or even in Queensland, or such minor gains as good coffee and civilised licensing laws in Queensland. In fact, basically, everything that we have around us today was once a utopian vision. And we have mobile phones, we have solar panels, we have the advances, the creature comforts that we depend on, because no one in an earlier generation assumed that they were at the zenith of civilization and that they couldn't make things better. And we stand on their shoulders. We have societies in which there is no slavery, in which women have the vote, in which there is good coffee and civilised licensing laws, because people in previous generations worked for those changes. If our civilisation survives, it will seem equally odd as it does to us looking back at a time when women couldn't vote or when slaves were bought and sold. It will seem equally odd that politicians could get away with making economic decisions without considering the social and ecological impacts. That they could get away with saying, yes, we're committed to reducing emissions and slowing climate change, but we'll approve a new gas field that will result in more emissions than the entire Australian transport system. It will seem impossible that people got away with that sort of talk. And this is the final note I'd like to leave with you. This is my granddaughter at a school kids climate demonstration, carrying a little placard which I think sums up what is our fundamental duty. John Sinclair's legacy is we need to care for our world. We need to care for our biodiversity. We need to act as if this planet is the only home we have and the only home we will ever have. There is no realistic prospect of mass migration to another part of the cosmos or rescue by friendly aliens. There is no planet B. It is our responsibility to recognise what a wonderful country this was when our ancestors seized it, and recognise that we have a duty to all future generations to protect as much as we can of our unique biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was the most enlightening and extraordinary lecture. And I'm very proud that FIDO was able to sponsor a lecture of that quality and to have you that we can draw on to deliver it. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to
Ian, on behalf of FIDO and on behalf of everybody present, I'd like to present you with a small token of our gratitude.
Small?
Sustainable, I'm sure. And that was an excellent talk. I think I speak for everyone. As Peter just said, that was a fantastic way of looking at it, as a physicist would provide, a different way of looking at how we have to change things. And I'm optimistic that we can change them, but it has to happen.
Absolutely.
Now.
Absolutely. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks
so much for
Thanks.
all. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Make a presentation on behalf of FIDO to one of FIDO's longest members, and in fact I've known this person for most of my life, so they can guess who they are. So FIDO's moved to make Tikiko Sue Dawson a life member of FIDO, and Sue, could you please come down? Sue's very shy. Sue's been actively involved with Gari forever. She's been going on trips with FIDO back when FIDO was, and I were about 10 years old. And she's been coming along on trips with Dad forever. And then in the last 20 odd years, she's been leading, along with Dad, actively leading trips for bush regeneration, at Eurong especially, but all over the island. So on behalf of FIDO, welcome as a life member.
Thank you very much.
This is for you. Thank you. Did you like to say anything?
Okay. Just I'd like to say thank you to everyone. Also, we have a wonderful volunteer with me. That's the key fact. As well as these people have lot of passion, love, responsibility come with us. So I'd like to really thank you, this volunteer with me. That big effect to our work. We are working at Eurong at the moment that really bad invest weed, coral creeper. It's a creep out from the private property and very, very hard to control. So a long-term result is now really come to the turning point. I really tell to everyone that they come have look or help because we noticed new native plants creeping up. That a change, I believe, change the soil condition to more or less main plants, sensitized other tiny seed. So I really try to keep up to see these little babies. So that is really some hope. So anyway, thank you very much. Support us.
Yes, I thought so. Hang on. Sorry, Sue, we forgot these. So this
And there's more.
these are for you too.
So thank you, Keith. Thank you, Sue. And thank you, Ian. And thank you all for coming. When we first talked about establishing a John Sinclair Memorial Lecture, my first thoughts were, it's a bloody lot of work, and is it really worth it? But we've been through 2 of them now, and the next one scares me, just because of the amount of work that I know it needs to make it happen. But I'm convinced that it is worth doing. It's important to get good, informed, science-based assessments of what is happening in our world. And Ian did it beautifully. So thank you so much. Join us for afternoon tea, and it's a biennial event, so you'll get another invitation.